I am, and I say this without fear of contradiction, by far the oldest speaker you'll be hearing from today. I'm 91. What can someone so old, you may be wondering, have to say that's useful to us women in our prime? Well, age brings few benefits, but one is experience. I've had an interesting life. I've seen a lot in my time. I may even have acquired a certain amount of wisdom. Knowledge, they say, is one of the few things that grows when it's shared. So let me share some of mine. But first, my credentials. I'm a software engineer by trade and a successful entrepreneur. I was once one of the richest women in Britain. But today, I describe myself as a venture philanthropist, dedicated to giving away my money, and wisely. I like to think of myself as a role model for other women. And I'm still busy, still active, still trying to bring about change. I'm not an old lady going on about fossils. But beware, the older I get, the better I used to be. When Mozart was my age, he'd been dead for over 50 years. My life wasn't meant to be interesting, and I wasn't always Steve Shirley. I was born Stephanie Buchtal into a middle-income household in Germany. But my father was Jewish. And in 1939, I arrived in Britain at the age of 5 as one of the child refugees spirited out of Nazi Europe by what became known as the Kindertransport. I was lucky. My experiences as a refugee might have damaged me beyond repair. Instead, they made me resilient. I learned to be self-reliant and to make the best of what life offered me. As a very young woman in the mid-1950s, I worked at Britain's Post Office Research Station. It sounds rather quaint now, but in those days it was one of the most advanced research organizations in the world. Some of the earliest computers were developed there, initially during the Second World War for use by men and women breaking enemy codes. The work we were doing was at the very edge of scientific and technological development. My own tasks may have been mundane, but I shared in the thrill and team spirit which came from knowing that I was a small part of something truly groundbreaking. I liked my male colleagues in those early days. Indeed, I liked one so much, I married him. But there was always a feeling of discontent because, quite simply, the men were paid more and their employment prospects were much, much better. I resented that. When I sought a promotion, my application came to nothing. I was a woman in a world where women were paid less, patronized constantly, promoted only reluctantly, and deemed incapable of responsibility. So I've got first-hand experience, like many women of my generation, of what it's like to suffer discrimination in the workplace. And it's made me deeply committed to ensuring that others don't suffer in the same way. After I hit the glass ceiling, I took matters into my own hands. In 1962, I set up one of the first high-tech companies in Britain. Freelance Programmers was a company of women, a company for women, a software house which recruited professionally qualified women who had, as was then the norm, left the industry on marriage or when expecting their first child and wanted to continue working, but from home, long before working from home became the trend. Zonta member Anne Moffatt led the technical team. I've since thought that we should have called the company Amazon, not like Jeff Bezos after the South American River, but after the Amazons, the female warriors of Greek myth, whose skill and strength were legendary and who fought as fiercely as the men. That kind of skill, that strength, was something I aspired to. But I'm glad we didn't go that route. It was hard enough persuading men to give us work without frightening them with a name that called to mind a bunch of bloodthirsty women who gave men no quarter. As it was, I felt obliged to disguise the nature of my workforce and my own gender too. When no one replied to my business development letters, I learned that if I signed them not with the double feminine Stephanie Shirley, but Steve Shirley, potential customers would not only read them, but pick up the phone to reply. By the time they discovered that Steve was actually a woman, they were already half hooked. To be taken seriously, I had to pretend to be a man. In due course, we became successful, though it took many years for us to realize quite how well we had done. Growth takes time, and you need patience. It was 25 years before we paid a dividend, and then it was puny. One thing that characterizes the successful entrepreneur is resilience, and I had to recover from several failures. The first recession I managed through brought things to a crunch. It was a rude awakening to find that the company's growth up to then had been driven not by us being clever, but by the market. Being unprepared, it was then that I had to quickly learn the art of the liquidator, to focus on essentials. I got to the stage of selling personal capital items. Our company nearly went bust. But then, most new companies do fail. There were steep compromises. There always seemed to be an excess of work and shortage of funds. More month than money. We were running out of cash, even though we were in profit. When one of our early customers made a takeover bid, I was delighted at the prospect of getting some capital in. My original passion had been the writing of the software, but I had delegated that to others. I was left with a mixture of administrative and managerial tasks, which was starting to overwhelm me. Perhaps these new investors would relieve me of some of this tedious work, I thought. But before the takeover was finalized, these new people effectively told me to do something that I considered unethical. And I realized I wasn't ready to give up that aspect of control. So I canceled the plans and this left me in severe difficulty because I had foolishly already taken on staff in the expectation of the deal happening. But I'd done the right thing, and that was an important lesson learned. Success means nothing if it's bought at the expense of ethical behavior and of the self-respect that comes with behaving ethically. On that occasion, I knew I'd acted in the right way, and I've tried to do so ever since. Some, at least, of Freelance Programmer's success was down to the fact that we were pioneers of diversity in our industry. In America today, diversity is under threat. It's part of the DEI trinity with equity and inclusion, which Donald Trump and Elon Musk so loathe. But diversity is a wonderful spur to innovation. In truth, we were all innovators in those days because the IT industry was so new. But not all of us were truly able to think outside the box. I could perhaps, because unlike almost everyone else in the industry, I was a woman, and so already, so to speak, outside the box. In due course, long after I'd handed over the management to others, the company I founded made me rich. I prized my wealth, not as a man might, for the power and influence it brought me, or simply as an outward measure of my success. I prized it for the ability it gave me to achieve and realize goals. I wanted to use my money for a purpose. And I discovered it gave me choices I would not otherwise have had. I learned a very simple truth. The wealth which creates the greatest happiness is the wealth you give away. Today, I describe myself as a venture philanthropist, dedicated to helping others benefit from my money. The spur for this was my son Giles, our only child. He was a beautiful baby and started off so contented that at first we thought he was doing rather well. But at 2.5, like a changeling in a fairy story, he turned into a wild, unmanageable toddler, far, far beyond the terrible twos. The bombshell diagnosis was that he was profoundly autistic. He lost what little language he had, and he never spoke again. Giles became increasingly difficult, banging his head repetitively and sometimes lashing out at us. He needed constant attention and care. Like other parents of a child with a learning disability, his condition came to dominate our lives. And eventually, this strong and sometimes violent young man became too much for us to cope with. He was hospitalized and spent 11 sad years in a locked ward of an old-style asylum. At the end of that time, when conditions deteriorated and the company was well established, we decided to look after him again ourselves, this time with paid help. And so it was that Giles became the first resident in the first home of my first charity, Autism at Kingwood, named for the village in which it was set up. We established it to provide long-term support for adults with autism. Today, it supports 150 adults. Later, I founded a groundbreaking school for pupils with autism called Prior's Court. My third charity is called Autistica. It funds and lobbies for medical research. Started in 2004, it's now the largest autism research charity in Europe. Not so wonderful as it sounds, because there's so few others. Any of my book sales and speaking fees go to Autistica, and it all goes to make autistic people's lives longer, healthier, and happier. I have donated nearly £70 million to these and founded others not-for-profit projects, such as the Oxford Internet Institute, which focuses on the social, economic, legal, and ethical issues, not the technology. Philanthropy is all that I do now, and it has nothing to do with stamps. I need never worry about getting lost, because several charities would quickly come and find me. So what have I learned since I started out in the 1950s? I've learned that life is more fulfilling if you can see beyond yourself, if you can understand the broader picture. That means having more than just personal goals. It means having goals for your community, your profession, and your country. I've learned that progress comes from making a series of small steps rather than one giant leap. And I've also learned that it's fine to make mistakes, but not to repeat them. If we try new things, we're bound to make errors. The trick is to make them only once and to learn from them. I have learned that technology is marvelous, and it's certainly opened up a wonderful life for me. But it must be properly harnessed. The human must be at the heart of technology, something the rise of artificial intelligence is forcing many of us to consider afresh. I have learned that nobody in business does anything really valuable by themselves. It's all a matter of teamwork. And one should work always for the good of the team. Listen to others with goodwill. Cherish the differences between you and your colleagues. Those differences are one of the things that make your team effective and creative. And always be kind. Remember how costly in human terms just one harsh remark can be. These are really lessons about leadership. Learning how to lead has been one of the most fascinating and the most rewarding aspects of my career. People in business talk a lot about the need to attract smart people. But smart people will only take you so far. They need directing. They need guiding. They need leadership. Intelligence and experience are necessary but not sufficient qualities for a good leader. Leadership requires vision as well. And in the 21st century, leadership is as much about values as anything else, which means that it's becoming more feminine, because that sort of leadership plays to women's strengths. Above all, I've learned that the trick is to have the confidence to seize one's opportunities. The future is bright. It is yours to shape and to mold. I trust you have the strength and the skill, and even on occasion, perhaps the Amazonian ferocity, to do that well. Thank you.